Great. Good morning, everybody. Just as you heard, this meeting will be recorded. My name is Bridget Tarrant. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters. Thank you for joining us this morning for our hot topics on offshore wind. Just a few housekeeping things. First of all, just to let you know, the League of Women Voters of the Lower Cape Fair is a nonpartisan organization, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties. We are also an organization fully committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in principle and in practice. League of Women Voters of Lower Cape Fair also recognizes the tribal lands of the Waccamaw Siouan and indigenous people of the Lower Cape Fair. To learn more about our policies and organization, you can visit our website, which is listed on the screen, or you can look for our link to social media and the website in the chat. So I would like to introduce Beth Hansen, who is the co-chair of our environmental action team, and she will introduce the speakers for today. So over to you.
Thank you, Bridget.
You're welcome.
I'd also like to welcome everyone to our presentation today. We're delighted to see so many of you, at least virtually. I'm glad you're joining us. With renewed interest in offshore wind off of our local coast, League of Women Voters thought it would be a good time to educate the community a little bit more on this topic. So a little background. Last March, the North Carolina Department of Commerce completed a study of the state's potential for manufacturing and transportation sector jobs related to offshore wind. In June, Governor Cooper issued Executive Order 218, calling for 2.8 gigawatts of wind energy off the coast of North Carolina by 2030. In late October, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management announced a proposed lease sale for offshore wind in the Wilmington East wind energy area, which is off the coast of Brunswick County, with the intention of offering one or more leases by mid-2022. Our two speakers today are members of the Offshore Wind for North Carolina Coalition. They'll provide their insights into the benefits of offshore wind and address questions about the potential impacts of offshore wind turbines. Let me introduce them. Jaime Simmons has been with the Southeastern Wind Coalition since June 2017. In her role as program manager, she works with a variety of stakeholders to advance offshore wind in North Carolina, including outreach and education, campaign development, partner coordination, and research. Jaime has a BA in political science from Ohio State and a Green MBA from Green Mountain College, completing a preliminary sustainability pathway for a power systems manufacturer as her capstone project. Prior to the Southeast Wind Coalition, Jaime worked in the healthcare and residential mortgage industries. Jaime is a member of the Women of Renewable Energy Industries and Sustainable Energy. He previously served as treasurer of the board of directors at Toxic Free North Carolina. Jaime lives in Durham with her husband, John, and daughter, Hattie. Sorry. Our other speaker is Greg Andeck. He serves as Director of Strategy and Government Relations for the North Carolina State Office of the National Audubon Society. He oversees Audubon's policy priorities and political strategy with the General Assembly, Office of the Governor, and state agencies. He also plays a lead role in message development, grassroots engagement, and coordination with partner organizations. Prior to joining Audubon, Greg led Environmental Defense Fund's Clean Energy Program in North Carolina, where he engaged companies, regulators, and policymakers to transform the state's electric grid in a way that boosted renewables, energy efficiency, and reductions in air pollution. He also led new project development for the organization's corporate partnership program. Greg earned his BS degree from Cornell University and a Master's of Environmental Management degree from Duke University's Nicholas School of Environment. Greg and his wife, Lisa, reside in Carborough, North Carolina with their two sons and take every opportunity to hike, camp, and explore North Carolina's natural wonders. Welcome, Jaime and Greg. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks so much, Beth. Let me try to tee up my presentation here. How does that look?
Looks fine.
Wonderful. Awesome. Wonderful. So thanks, Beth. I really appreciate y'all having me here today. Again, I'm Jaime Simmons. I'm the program manager with the Southeastern Wind Coalition. We're a nonprofit that works to break down barriers and misconceptions, share information, and convene stakeholders on issues surrounding both land-based and offshore wind. So I wanted to share first a little bit about the coalition that Beth mentioned, that Greg and I are a part of. We officially launched Offshore Wind for North Carolina back in September. And in addition to a lot of the momentum that we're seeing that Beth touched on, both federally and at the state level, certainly we're the wind people. So we've always been supportive of wind, but many other organizations were growing their interest in and support of offshore wind because there are a lot of different reasons to support offshore wind, which is part of what we're here to share a little bit about today. And our, I think 11 organizations now have come together with our different perspectives and priorities to work together to advance offshore wind in North Carolina. So you can see a full list of our organizations here on the right, and then our stated goals on the left. So to support positive state and federal policy, to advocate for responsible offshore wind development, and to ensure a positive regulatory atmosphere and continued progress on development. So our social media handles and website are listed down below, and we'd love for you all to join us and follow along with the progress that we're seeing and working towards. So just to kick us off, I wanted to give you all a bit of an update on development off the North Carolina coast. So certainly that's top of mind given the progress lately with the Wilmington East wind energy area. So I thought it'd be best to start there. Here you can see a map of the 3 wind energy areas off the coast of North Carolina. Further north is the Kitty Hawk wind energy area, and the 2 nearest to, I imagine most of you joining us today in the southern part of the state, are Wilmington East in the blue and Wilmington West in the green. So Kitty Hawk is in the north is fairly far along in the regulatory process. In the middle of 2021, Audubon Grid Renewables, the developer that has ownership of that lease, submitted their construction and operations plan. And I'll show you a timeline of that regulatory process to put that into perspective. But it's one of the final steps before the federal government gives authorization for construction to begin. Progress on the 2 Wilmington areas really started to move forward in the beginning of 2021. And that's when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, which is an office within the Federal Department of the Interior that's responsible for leasing and permitting offshore energy development. BOEM reconvened their intergovernmental task force. So that's comprised of federal, state, and local government officials and agencies, though the meetings are open to the public. So they heard feedback from stakeholders about potentially moving forward with leasing Wilmington East and West. They also decided to revise the existing environmental assessment, which Greg will likely be touching on a little bit. That was a pre-lease evaluation that was done for all 3 lease areas in 2015. But given that Kitty Hawk was the only lease area that moved forward, it hadn't been updated with new science and data since 2015. So based on feedback, both informally as well as through the public comment process on that environmental assessment, BOEM decided to eliminate all of Wilmington West, so again, here in the green, and a small portion of Wilmington East from consideration of leasing at this point. And that was largely due to right whale critical habitat designation. BOEM did decide, however, to advance consideration of leasing the majority of Wilmington East, which is really where we are today. So in November, BOEM released a proposed sale notice, so essentially a draft sale notice and asked for feedback on a number of questions and potential lease provisions that they're considering implementing for a lease. So those comments were due to BOEM on January 3rd and are starting to be made public in the Federal Register. I'm happy to share a link for anyone that's curious to take a look at those. But a bit about the lease area itself. So it's just over 127,000 acres, which is quite similar to the Kitty Hawk Wind Energy area, as well as the Dominion lease area, just a little further north off the coast of Virginia Beach. So we anticipate it to be able to accommodate a similar number of turbines or generating capacity. So right around 2,600 megawatts or 2.6 gigawatts, which for context on size, that's a really big fossil or nuclear plant, but more like 2 times the size of the standard, say, natural gas or nuclear plant. So it's a lot of power. And then this revised area, I mentioned a little sliver was cut off for right rail critical habitat designation, excuse me. This revised area begins about 19 miles off the coast of Bald Head Island, or 22 miles from the closest mainland point, which is Oak Island. So SEWC, my organization, commissioned some visual simulations of this lease area from a couple of points in Brunswick County, Bald Head Island, Oak Island, and Holden Beach. And we're actually presenting those at an open house in Southport next Friday, the 28th. So I have a link here to register for that. I also have an invitation on the next slide, and then Beth and LCV will share a link with you all as well if you're interested in joining us. What I can share with you in the meantime is that this lease area is extremely far from shore. So for context, it is much further than most of the lease areas in the Northeast. And even from the nearest point on Bald Head Island are so small that you really have to know that they're there to be able to see them. And also needs to be an extremely, extremely clear day. Which is, given the haze in the summer isn't all too often. And then finally, we do anticipate that BOEM will be moving forward with a lease auction. So the agency is has announced holding a lease auction for a couple of lease areas in New York next month. And still needs to examine all of the comments that I mentioned that were just submitted on January 3rd. So just given those two things that the agency needs to get through, it could technically be as early as March, but we're anticipating that auction to be held in April or May. And again, I would encourage you all to sign up for updates from the Offshore Wind for North Carolina Coalition that we've linked in the first slide. We'll be providing updates on that auction and any other BOEM dates or deadlines, and of course, coalition events that way. And then here's just a quick, this slide is linked. So once you get a copy of it, you can just scroll over it and get a link to the event website as well, if you'd like to join us on the 28th. So this slide is a snapshot of the BOEM regulatory process. Kitty Hawk, I hope you can see my cursor, but Kitty Hawk is right about here in the process. So they're fairly advanced. And right now we're seeing Wilmington East is right about here. So BOEM estimates that this process in total takes about 10 years. So at the rate that projects have historically advanced, we're looking at no sooner than 6, but probably more in the range of 6 to 8 years before we see steel in the water on the southern coast of North Carolina. And down below, these little people here indicate, kind of correspond with the timeline above it and indicate public comment period. So certainly more opportunities to contribute, which is just through the formal federal process. And certainly there will be plenty of engagement opportunities with the eventual leaseholder, the state, and others working on offshore wind to leading up to construction to inform their process. So that's a little bit about the state of things. But what I wanted to focus the remainder of my time on is sharing with you the value proposition of offshore wind and why we see this as a once in a generation opportunity for the state. And a big part of that for SEWC is the economic opportunity. So this is a new industry for the US, certainly established in Europe, but new domestically. And so it will require in large part an entirely new manufacturing sector, as well as many thousands of capable hands to install and operate these machines. In order to reach the president's 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to be deployed by 2030, it's expected to require $109 billion of private sector investment. Now, 16 billion you can see on the far right-hand side, that's attributed to construction, installation, maintenance, and decommissioning. But the large majority of that is actually in the manufacturing supply chain. So as I mentioned, this is a new industry here, which will require specialized facilities, most of them close to the water, that don't yet exist in the US. But there are also many thousands of subcomponents that can be manufactured more inland. So the opportunity is really threefold. New large component manufacturing facilities on the water, new smaller component facilities, and then components from existing facilities that are already making similar components that can retool and expand their operations to support offshore wind manufacturing, which is particularly interesting for North Carolina. So some additional benefits, I mentioned manufacturing. Of course, this is a huge one. Most of that 109 billion, so 93, the remainder will come from the manufacturing supply chain. I also wanted to touch on tourism a bit. Certainly that is a primary question for coastal communities. And in many case studies, we find that offshore wind provides a benefit to tourism. So for example, the country's first offshore wind farm was Block Island, which is only 3 nautical miles from the coast of Block Island, Rhode Island. Very similar to Bald Head Island in both economy and demographics. The University of Rhode Island studied before, during, and after installation and found a 19% increase in occupancy rates and an increase of $3,500 in annual rental income. Similarly, in a more kind of established market in the UK off the coast of Brighton, which is another tourist destination, much like Block Island, the Rampion Wind Farm, I believe is 10 nautical miles off the coast, so well within sightline, just like Block Island. The British Tourism Authority found an increase in overnight visits by 10,000 the first year after construction, and then by 30,000 the following year. Fishing kind of dovetails a little bit into that, particularly recreational fishing can see potentially a benefit as well. So the fish species I have listed here have been found around the foundation of the 2-turbine demonstration project in Virginia. And then Block Island, again, the project I mentioned in Rhode Island, now has a number of new charter boat operations that specifically go out to the turbines to fish. So a new sector of the tourism economy that exists there. And then finally, ports, providing another industry just to help diversify the commerce used by the port. And then we've seen a number of investments made in port infrastructure up and down the East Coast to support offshore wind, such as investments in heavy lift equipment. And those can be used by other port tenants to support other industries and users. And those investments wouldn't have been made if not for the presence of the offshore wind industry. But back to this manufacturing and operating economic benefit. I mentioned the 109 billion for the US, but what does that mean for us in North Carolina? We actually, I'm pretty excited to announce we've been working on this for quite some time. Just today published a study that makes that calculation. So we gathered data and information from a number of sources, also ran some economic calculations using industry standard models. And we found both the total costs and total economic benefits for constructing 2.8 gigawatts of offshore wind off the coast of North Carolina, which, as Beth mentioned, aligns with the goals set by the governor through Executive Order 218 earlier last year. And we found that the economic benefits far outweigh the costs. So during construction, 2.8 gigawatts would generate nearly 31,000 jobs. This is a little tricky. I want to be really clear with this one. That's in job years. So construction of this size could take a number of years. It varies. We estimate for a project this size to be about 3 years. So really that would be somewhere in the ballpark of 10,000 jobs per year for construction. And over 6 billion economic output. And then during its operational lifetime, which is around 25 to 30 years, another 6 billion in economic output and nearly 1,000 full-time, long-term, very well-paying positions to operate and maintain the facility, as well as provide, replacement tools and parts. And we know that North Carolina is very well positioned to accommodate both that manufacturing and operational piece. We actually have the highest net technical potential for development on the East Coast, largely due to our long coastline and shallow outer continental shelf. We also have a huge manufacturing economy. So we're first in manufacturing in the Southeast, the size of our manufacturing workforce and economy. And we already have a huge footprint of manufacturers that work and supply to the land-based wind industry, which again can retool to support offshore wind and expand their business. And then of course 2 deep water ports and a world-class university and community college system to further support our value proposition. And this map again just reinforces that, shows the presence of manufacturers that supply land-based wind. Almost a fifth are in the Southeast broadly, and then many of those in the Southeast here in North Carolina. And this economic opportunity is one that many states are very keen to and actively working towards. And how they're doing that is in large part by making commitments to develop offshore wind off their coasts. Because what we've seen so far is that these major manufacturing facilities, they're choosing to locate in states that are making development commitments. So you can see the states that have made these binding commitments to develop offshore wind. New York has committed to 9,000 megawatts. Our neighbor Virginia has committed to 5,200 megawatts. And we've seen manufacturing facility announcements in both of those states, as well as New Jersey. So while we have many attributes that make us attractive to the industry, we know it's still extremely important that we see that commitment in order to solidify, again, our value proposition and get as much of that economic investment as we possibly can. Excuse me. I also wanted to share that that we know that North Carolina voters, specifically coastal voters, support offshore wind. So we conducted some polling back in August, and what we found is that most voters support offshore wind development off our coast and recognize the benefit that it will bring in both investment and well-paying jobs to their communities. 70% of these voters also support expanding clean energy and see that offshore wind is important in that effort. And then back to the visual impact piece, we really wanted to tune in and ask coastal residents about their opinions there. And what we found is that it's actually a very minimal concern to most. So only 7% of coastal voters said that it was a top concern of theirs. And then finally, before I quit yapping and pass it over to Greg, who I know most of you really want to hear from, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the energy system and why offshore wind is so important as we transition to a carbon-free electricity system. And many of those points I've touched on in one way or another. But first is that it generates power close to where we need it. So this is a map of population centers. The bright lights indicate where electricity is used the most. And I've overlaid a map of the coastal wind speeds over top. So you can see a lot of those load centers that need power are close to the coast, and it can be hard to get electricity out that way from inland. So it brings power from a new, different direction. And again, in close proximity to where it's used and needed most. Second is just how much of it there is. So again, this is average wind speeds. Anything above 7 meters per second is really viable for development, which you can see is most of the coast. It's the darker yellows, oranges, and reds. And then I've overlaid how that can translate into quantity or capacity of electricity. And here in North Carolina, we actually have a technical potential to cover our energy needs many times over with offshore wind alone. I'm not necessarily advocating for one generation source, but this is just another indicator that we have a lot of opportunity, which also means a lot of opportunity to displace fossil fuels. And then finally, this graph can be a bit tricky, but I'll walk you through it. The yellow line is solar, the light blue lines are land-based wind, and the dark blue line is offshore wind. And this is when we see each of those technologies producing electricity throughout the day for each season. And what this graph tells us is a few things. So first, offshore wind is really steady. It's among the flattest of all renewable generation. So there are less spikes for when it does and doesn't generate. It's also generating a lot. We don't, I don't want to dive into the technicalities of it, but this graph shows that offshore wind is producing right around the same rate that natural gas plants tend to be operated. So the variability is less, very predictable, stable power. And then finally, you can see that all of these lines, solar, land-based wind, and offshore wind, they're all very complementary to one another. So they balance each other out. And as we move towards, again, 100% carbon-free electricity generation, these technologies are all really important to have on our grid system because they work really well together to balance everything out and minimize volatility. So they're all very important to get us to that goal. So that is all for me. I appreciate y'all listening. I'll stick around but pass it over to stick around for questions, but I'll pass it over to Greg.
Great, thanks, Jaime. Let me pull up my slides here. Can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. See some heads nodding. Thank you all for having me. Real pleasure to be here. Jaime, you said everyone wanted to hear my slides. I think they wanted to hear from you. So I enjoyed you walking through the economic opportunity there. Before I start, I want to apologize. I have a little bit of a cold. So if I have a little bit of a tickle in my throat, that's what's going on. Well, hopefully it won't affect me here. As Beth mentioned earlier, I'm the Director of Government Relations for the North Carolina State Office of the National Audubon Society. One of our local chapters, actually the Cape Fear Audubon chapter, which some of you may be members of, so thank you for any Audubon members that may be out there. I'm going to talk a little bit about Audubon's position on offshore wind and how we arrived at kind of our viewpoint on offshore wind and really how we're thinking about maximizing the opportunity of the resource while mitigating and minimizing potential harm on birds. There's of course lots of other critters besides birds that we care about, and other groups, are more equipped to talk about impacts on right whales. But I am going to focus on birds through that lens today. And where I'll really just start out is by saying where our work, has really originated from. So in 2019, Audubon completed many months long study of really trying to figure out what is the impact of climate change on birds. We knew that there were increasing impacts, but we didn't know quite what the full extent would be and how species would be impacted into the future as temperatures increase, as there were changes to habitat and food sources. And so in 2019, Audubon releases groundbreaking study, Survival by Degrees. And I encourage anyone to just Google Audubon Survival by Degrees, and you can really play around with the tool that helps you visualize the impacts of climate change on birds. But one of the key findings was quite sobering, which was that 2/3 of North American birds are risked of extinction due to climate change if we see scenarios of 3 degrees temperature rise, which if we don't really take significant action and significant steps towards transitioning our electric grid to clean energy, we will be on track to getting to 3 degrees. The good news is that if we can keep temperature rise to 1.5 degrees or less, we can actually save about 75% of those birds. So that really, communicated to us and to our broader membership base that, look, if we can take action now and take significant steps, we can really protect the birds that we care so much about. So I mentioned if you go to our Survival by Degrees website, you can play around with our tool. One of the things you can do is look at individual species and take a look at their current range, and then how that range is expected to be impacted in the future under different warming scenarios. So this is the northern Gannet. Gannet, it's an amazing bird. You may have seen this bird on the coast. It flies up above the water, and then when it spots a prey fish, it will dive down in a torpedo fashion and dive bomb underwater and grab that fish. Amazing bird. This is one of the birds that is going to be most impacted by climate change. So under a 3 degree temperature warming scenario, the northern gannet actually loses 70% of its range, which really puts it in a severely threatened or potential extinction scenario. So that's obviously very bad and something that we want to try to avoid. And one of the ways to do that is really thinking about fundamentally transitioning our clean energy grid. It's a daunting challenge. If you just look at the legacy coal generation and gas generation in our plant, in our power sector, and all the legacy emissions baked into our vehicles, and then think about what it's going to take to transition that to clean energy and electric vehicles, it's a very big challenge. But fortunately, we have the technology and the know-how to do it. So in our view, it's more a matter of political willpower. And the good thing is that in North Carolina, our lawmakers are increasingly stepping up and recognizing that this is an urgent challenge that we need to address. So just this past year, bipartisan group of lawmakers and Governor Cooper reached an agreement on House Bill 951, which will require a 70% greenhouse gas reduction from the electric power sector by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. That's a really important step forward and an important signal to the market that North Carolina is serious about reducing its carbon emissions. And those type of signals are what attracts offshore wind developers and other clean energy renewable providers who want to do business, and they're looking at lots of different states And now they're saying, all right, North Carolina wants to see this type of investment. We want to make more investments in the state. Many of you also saw Governor Cooper's executive order on wind, Executive Order 218 of 2.8 gigawatts, offshore wind by 2030, 8 gigawatts by 2040. That followed on the heels of a Biden administration offshore wind goal. And then, of course, our major electric power provider, Duke Energy, has its own internal carbon reduction goals, a 50% reduction by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So in a lot of ways, lawmakers and industry are recognizing the importance of addressing this critical threat to people and birds and other wildlife, and establishing these policies to get there. But while we do this transition, we have to do it right. And that's really where Audubon stands on offshore wind. We actively support the development and growth of offshore wind energy and transmission, but it does need to be properly sited to avoid, minimize, and mitigate the impacts on birds and other wildlife. And I'll talk a little bit about how we think we can do that, how we think we can walk and chew gum at the same time, if you will. And a big part of it is working together, right? There's so many different developers, local governments, grassroots, community members who are going to need to be part of this conversation. And the only way that we can do this in a way that's going to meet the needs of responding to the climate change threat, and also do it in a way that's really going to protect wildlife at the same time, as if we're working together, if we're sharing the latest research and data, and figuring out the right pathway forward. And it's one of the reasons why we co-founded the Offshore Wind for North Carolina Coalition that Jaime talked about earlier. Is we recognize this need to bring together a lot of diverse partners, including some that folks wouldn't ordinarily think are going to be supportive of wind energy, like Audubon. So one key thing I just want to leave everyone with here is, like, birds move, right? They move incredible distances. I mean, it's one of the truly amazing feats in the animal kingdom. If you think about these tiny organisms that travel thousands of miles, many starting in Canada or Alaska, then they overwinter in South America. And some of those birds do travel on that journey along the Atlantic coast, including off North Carolina's coast, through areas that are being considered for wind. So we really need to make sure that we understand with a high level of precision, which birds are moving across these areas. Is that a threat? Is it not a threat? And then how do we really mitigate any potential conflict in the future? So here's just a very tangible example. This is black-poll warbler, breeds in Alaska and Canada, and then flies down to South America for the winter. You can see that this bird directly flies off of our coast. Some individuals will likely fly across the Wilmington East wind energy area and other wind energy areas that we may see into the future. So the task at hand is to figure out, how do we protect this bird while at the same time growing our industry? And a big part of that is going to be really leveraging new technology. So you'll see a geolocator on this bird's back. Technologies like that allow us to track and communicate with individual wind projects, and at certain times actually curtail or temporarily shut down those projects to allow these birds to pass through, is going to be one example of an important solution moving forward. So when we think about birds and potential impacts from offshore wind projects, so really kind of three primary considerations. One is thinking about it, impact from a population level, right? So it's unlikely that there's going to be zero impact, right? There's going to be likely some impact. How do we make that as little as possible? While at the same considering how is the effect and the impact of offshore wind farm, how does that threat compare to other potential threats along that bird's pathway? So keeping it all in perspective. Also keeping in mind what is the current state of that individual species population. So there are going to be some species that are incredibly threatened or rare. A good example is the red knot. There's really not that many red knots left. So we have to be extra diligent in making sure that we protect every single individual that remains to really ensure that we have a strong population in the future. And that might mean that we do more focused tagging of those individuals with those geolocators I mentioned and other more specific data collection to ensure that we know how those birds are moving around these areas. The second big effect that we think about is direct collision impacts. So we want to avoid any potential risk of collision. Two big parts of that. One is siting, right? So the further offshore that we can get these projects, typically there is going to be less impact to birds. Most birds that are on the coast are sticking and hugging pretty closely to the coastline, but not all, including some of the songbirds that I mentioned. But there's a trade-off, right? The further out you move a project, the less economic it becomes to develop. The more expensive it becomes, the longer the trips for technicians, the longer the transmission cable, and there does become a point at which that project doesn't become economic anymore. And so we really want to think about how do we move it far enough off to avoid the most significant impacts on birds while not so far that the project doesn't become realized anymore. And then lastly, related to collision is curtailment. So, I mentioned before, we want to ultimately pair the data, real-time data on bird movement with the actual movement of the turbines. And in times when we know a flock is going through a wind area, we're going to actually have a system set up like we do on many land-based wind projects, where it's communicated to that wind developer or sometimes automated to shut that project down, allow those birds to pass through, and then you can shut that project back on again. And then lastly, a big effect that we are constantly thinking about is displacement. So we're not only concerned with direct collisions with the wind turbines, we're also concerned about whether birds are actually avoiding wind energy areas because of concern that birds can detect these turbines, and it's just a very unnatural thing in their environment. It may affect their food sources, and so you actually want to make sure that you're looking pre and post construction to say, like, are there real patterns here that birds are actually avoiding this area? Because if they're actively avoiding the area that they used, pretty significantly before, that's potentially loss of habitat for those birds and a concern. So those are really the three key factors that we're looking at when we think about bird effects. So touching on siting for a second, as Jaime mentioned earlier, about how we've gotten where we've gotten on the Wilmington East project. So as she mentioned, BOEM is going through multiple iterations of examining where the best places to put an individual wind farm. They're not only doing this off of North Carolina, they're doing this along the entire Atlantic coast and also starting to look at this in the Gulf. And what's happened in North Carolina is that many years ago, we started with this very large initial planning area in the light blue. And then over time, in response to stakeholder input, in response to really looking at the latest data on wildlife movements, in response to feedback from the shipping industry, from the military, from all these different constituencies, that area has gotten whittled down over time to the point now where, we have that green blob here on the right that represents the Wilmington East area. So I just really wanted to show that to emphasize this point that like where we are with the Wilmington East wind energy area from our perspective is a much more preferred outcome than some of the earlier wind energy areas that were on the table that we believed would have had much more impact from a bird and wildlife perspective. And certainly BOEM has listened to a lot of the stakeholders in that process. So I want to talk a little bit about adaptive management. This is like the stuff that's fun to geek out on. And I'm not our hardcore technical guy on some of this stuff, but I'm going to do my best to summarize it because I think it's really fascinating. So when we think about collecting data on bird movement and then using that data to then inform our use and management of these projects, there's kind of a few different ways that researchers are collecting this data right now. One is doing boat and aerial surveys. That's oftentimes, at a very high level. It's really good for kind of getting macro level effects of the impact of a wind project on large scale bird movement. So this would be a good example where like you would do this to chart the before and after effects of a project and to really see if birds are avoiding certain areas. So here are the dots showing the locations of individual birds that were spotted from some aerial surveys. Typically, this can only be done during the daytime. So if birds are moving at night, this is not going to pick it up. But this is a good way to kind of get a macro level sense of whether a project is actually affecting bird movement and potential loss of habitat. Here's some kind of aggregate information from some BOEM surveys over the last few years, looking at just seabird distributions and potential hotspots. So the brighter colors, the yellow, is higher density of birds that have been located along the coast. And then you can see the outlines of some of the wind energy areas that have been under consideration, although it looks like this survey may have been done before the Wilmington East area was developed, so that's not highlighted here, but it really goes to show you like this is kind of the aggregate level information that BOEM will then use to determine where are the best spots to avoid potential conflicts from a siting perspective. Then you can also use radar technologies. So that can really help us understand in real time different migration patterns and the timing of those migration patterns. So for certain species, we can kind of predict within a month or two when they're likely to be doing their migration either north or south. And so you might not really be needing to plan for curtailment of a wind project outside of those time periods. You can be hyper-focused on your mitigation approach. And so that's, again, one other like kind of tool in the tool belt that developers and wildlife stakeholders will be using. The challenge with both the aerial imagery and the radar technologies is that oftentimes really small birds can be missed, or birds that all look very similar have a hard time being distinguished amongst different species. And so that's where things like satellite and radio telemetry come into play, where you're actually tagging individual birds. So this is a fairly labor-intensive process. You actually have to go out and catch these birds with nets, attach the geolocator, and then you release them. And then, of course, you have to do it all over again the next year for new chicks to make sure that you're capturing new individuals. But for certain species that, like I said, are especially small and aren't picked up as well by some of the other technologies, or for certain species that are already fairly rare and imperiled, and there's a smaller number of individuals where you can actually tag a very large percentage of them, this may be a strategy that is used more commonly. So, so that's kind of my geeking out slide or set of slides. But ultimately, like the data is only as good as it's collected and as it's shared, right? And so one of the things that different states are doing in different ways right now is setting up these technical working groups for sharing all of this information. And so New York State actually has a really great model of a technical working group that's been funded and stood up by the state, where they bring together the leading researchers on wildlife and different species. And they're bringing industry and developers to the table to say, like, all right, what do we know? What do we not know? So what additional data do we need to gather? And then how do we really incorporate in the latest emerging technology to make sure that this can be a win-win for everyone? So this is just a great model that we're seeing in New York and some other states in New England. We're hoping to establish something similar in North Carolina, and have had some early conversations with state leaders and stakeholders about doing that, but nothing's been finalized quite yet. A core to those conversations is really moving towards this model where there's a built-in expectation and a built-in commitment from both regulators and developers that we're going to use the best available technology that's out there. The best available technology right now for land-based wind is infrared technology. It's fairly mature now for land-based wind projects, where you have a bird come within a certain distance of a wind farm. The infrared technology here will actually pick up that there's a bird nearby, and it will turn off one or more turbines. And then when that bird has moved on, those turbines can fire back up. So it's very much real time. It's sited, directly at the farm, and has worked extremely well in land-based wind projects. The technology has not been tested out very much in offshore wind applications. So that's really what needs to happen moving forward in the coming years. But I expect that this type of technology will become more commonly used. But there has to be an expectation and a desire from industry and regulators to make that happen. The good news is that regulators are listening. So this is related to the Vineyard Wind project off of Massachusetts, which has recently been approved, the largest wind project in the US. And there's a number of conditions that are tied to the permit for this project that the developer must follow. And so there are things like making sure that there's pre and post data collection. There's making sure that a certain number of tags are applied to some turns that they have some concern about, to install certain technology receivers. So the good news is regulators are listening to these concerns and really starting to build them into the requirements for these projects. And so for us, that gives us a lot of confidence that, like, indeed we can grow this industry and at the same time do it in the right way. And we feel some good amount of assurance by this initial project, but it's important for all of us to continue to communicate to BOEM through their comment process how important these type of actions are. So I'm happy to be in touch with anyone by email. Here's my info. And again, thanks for the opportunity here, because birds and people really depend on it. So I'm happy to take any questions, myself or Jaime.
All right, thank you, Greg and Jaime, for a great presentation. We do have several questions, so I'm just going to start from the first one and move on down. So the first few questions are going to be for you, Jaime. So the first couple of questions come from Hans Martin. Wants to know, what are the prevailing wind speeds of the Wilmington East versus the Kitty Hawk and Dominion?
Interesting, very technical question. So generally wind speeds increase in both speed and steadiness the further north that you get on the East Coast. So if I could maybe pull up that map again, but Maine, for instance, is the average wind speed is or wind resource is around 10 meters per second, which is phenomenal wind resource. I'm just kind of ballparking here with these general maps. I would imagine that we're looking at 7.5 meters per second in the Wilmington East wind energy area, and just maybe marginally higher, you know, with Kitty Hawk and Dominion somewhere in around 8. But again, I don't know the technical numbers, but just based on the wind speed maps, it's right around there.
That's fine. So this kind of leads in that same question, is the total, what is the total estimated energy product of each? So ballpark.
Well, so the total capacity that we anticipate from any of these projects, really generally, is right around 2.6 gigawatts or 2,600 megawatts. And again, for context, that's about 2 times the size of a large fossil fuel or nuclear plant. The capacity factor, which is a percentage of that, is what is kind of anticipated power production that you would get from a wind turbine or a project. And so the capacity factor of offshore wind is fairly high. It's actually noted in our study that we just conducted, so I wish I knew the exact number off the top of my head, but it's somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to 45%. So you're going to get 40 to 45% of that generating capacity from a project.
Okay, so that I think
we must have some engineers here on the good time.
That's what I'm thinking too. So I think that leads into this next question from Ann Stewart. Okay, so that basically boils down to, will the generation of this 2,600 megawatts be when it arrives on shore? You might have just answered that question.
That's right. Yeah. It's
okay. All right. Sorry, I am totally not into all the engineering part. So sorry if I repeat the same question in a different terminology.
No worries at all.
Then someone was asked, who will purchase the energy generated by the offshore wind?
Yeah, so here, given the regulatory atmosphere that we have here in North Carolina, the off-taker of that electricity, for the most part, will largely need to be Duke Energy. We do have a vertically integrated, regulated electricity system. There are some programs that allow for large either industrial or commercial customers like the Apples and Googles of the world to purchase renewable energy. We don't have many programs like that in North Carolina. And then specifically for offshore wind, it's not really applicable because there's just too much power. 2.6 gigawatts is a lot of electricity. And so in order to require the demand to offtake that much, you really need to be a big user like a utility.
And again, I'm just reading this in the order received. So again, Hans is asking, if steel in the water is 6 to 8 years out, What is the schedule for construction of substations and road towers on land?
Yes. Yeah, I saw that. There was a couple of questions about onshore infrastructure in the chat, which is a fantastic question. So just for a little bit of context, we reference this in our report that's just out today. Duke Energy and the North Carolina Transmission Planning Collaborative conducted a study about the onshore needs of the grid in order to accommodate 2.8 gigawatts of offshore wind. So I'm happy to share that that link when Greg's answering the wildlife questions. But I'm not Duke, and I'm not an engineer, so I don't know the exact timeline for those types of upgrades. What I can tell you is that the way that those upgrades work right now is that they're reactive. So you have to have a project, a generating project in place or planned in order to justify to our regulators that the transmission is needed. So we wouldn't see the building of onshore infrastructure ahead of a planned project. That is tough because onshore infrastructure can take a long time to permit and construct. And so certainly in order to see a full deployment of the carbon-free grid and of offshore winds, both in North Carolina and across the country, we really do need to see some adjustments in how onshore infrastructure, transmission, grid planning takes place into something that's more proactive rather than reactive by project.
I would say from a wildlife perspective, we care about where the power is coming onto shore, both if there's any trenching and making sure that doesn't have impacts on birds and other wildlife, and then of course like any substation that's installed on shore. In a lot of cases, it will likely make the most sense and probably have less of an impact on wildlife if it feeds into existing like large areas of electrical infrastructure. So tying into existing power plant transmission capacity makes a lot of sense and is maybe more a likely onshore situation, but those decisions will really happen at the utility level as they do grid planning. And the project for Wilmington East is just not nearly far enough along for any of those decisions to have been made.
Great. And then we have a question from Marlene Barney. It says, how are wind energy leases affected by local governmental opposition to wind energy, such as the unanimous vote by Brunswick County Commission opposing offshore wind energy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can tag team this one, Greg, but local governments are a formal participant in BOEM's intergovernmental task force that I mentioned. So their regulatory process for identifying lease areas, permitting them, and then overseeing construction and operation as well. And something else that Greg pointed to was how big of an area we usually start with when at the very, very beginning of a process, when we call it a call area. And BOEM continues to take in considerations from all stakeholders, certainly local governments, as a formal participant of that process, and whittles it down based on the feedback that they receive. Part of the adjustment of consideration for Wilmington East and West, or delayed consideration of permitting, was to ensure that they had robust feedback from stakeholders and local governments. And certainly the adjustment of the size over the years of those lease areas has taken that feedback into consideration. So it's for in a lot of ways, the process has really worked to incorporate feedback from lots of different stakeholders with lots of different perspectives to make sure that these lease areas end up accommodating as many stakeholder interests as possible.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is just that some of the community's elected officials have submitted formal comments through the BOEM process. So that's the way that their concerns will be registered. One kind of maybe side comment, but related, is that some of the polling data that the Southeast Wind Coalition conducted that Jaime shared earlier, it was really some surprising numbers, when they asked, and this was limited to really just like coastal residents, when they asked coastal residents, what are your biggest concerns about offshore wind, and asked them to rank those concerns. The number one concern for coastal residents from offshore wind projects was potential impact on wildlife. The lowest concern, the concern ranked number, 5th on that list, was visual impacts. So that was really interesting for us, because it's the reverse of what you hear in the news, which is that these local communities are putting out these resolutions, not wanting to have, projects nearby where they can see them. And so that's just a kind of a unique situation, that there's a little bit of a mismatch between the local elected officials and what they're prioritizing for their resolutions, and what actual voters and the coastal residents that were actually polled would suggest.
Interesting. Another question from Marlene is, given that the Army Corps of Engineers is ramping up the dredging to accommodate the increase in container ships here in Wilmington, will there be a conflict between that and offshore wind energy?
Yeah, so it's this is also difficult to pinpoint, because it would be very project specific, and we just aren't to that point with Wilmington East to have, we don't have a leaseholder, let alone really details on a project or plans for construction or even surveying. I do know in the Northeast, there's a New York project, for example, that's taking part in very constructive and collaborative process to ensure that other ocean users are not only considered, again, through that formal federal regulatory process, but that really minute details about timing of ocean use are worked out among ocean users. So I would imagine that would be both, handled broadly through the federal regulatory process, but also with the specific leaseholder, if and when there is one for Wilmington East, and those specific dredging projects.
And it's still, I would also just add that it's still an open question of whether or not, the bulk of shipping related to Wilmington East would come out of the Wilmington Port or Norfolk. A lot of investment in manufacturing and shipping capacity is going in at Norfolk. And so it's still an open question whether or not, developers in the supply chain will replicate that in Wilmington or not. There's also it's not clear how much, as a percentage of share of the shipping capacity that needs a deep port, how much of that, would be taken up by offshore wind, and whether offshore wind would really be the thing to drive the deepening of the port, as opposed to like it's happening already, and the offshore wind may just benefit from that. There are, some of different organizations have concerns about environmental effects of the deepening of the port, and so that's like kind of a side issue that folks are working on, but certainly something to think about as it relates to how this industry develops.
Great. I had a couple questions about the tourism issue. So why does offshore wind promote tourism? Like, is it the opportunity to spend the night on the platform near the turbines, or is there something specific that shows it increases tourism?
Yeah. I'm not sure about sleeping on a turbine foundation. But I do know that University of Rhode Island study, it's been a little bit since I've read it in its entirety, but did do a comparative study of proximal beaches to get an understanding of the regional market, and did not see the influx that they did see from Block Island. They didn't draw necessarily the conclusion that was absolutely because of the turbines, but you know, certainly can be to some degree implied. And then that study is linked in my presentation, so everyone's welcome to take a look at that, of course. There was another study that I didn't mention from the University of Delaware, I believe. It's speculative. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know the exact terminology, but you know, they were asking people's opinions not based on demonstrated activity or habit, because at the time we didn't have offshore wind farms in the US, but there was a lot of interest from tourists to visit beaches that had wind turbines, specifically if they were the first project in their state or region. So yeah, that's a little bit of background on the case studies and the research that we've seen.
I saw a comment from Joy that I thought was kind of a good perspective, and I think related to this question, which is that, you know, there's a decent number of folks that when they see these wind projects are really intrigued by them and actually find them really fascinating and excited about the innovation of clean energy technology. And so like it becomes a magnet to go and do tours of projects, go on a boat ride to see them up close. So it's kind of like a little mini tourism economy that can develop around seeing these projects. So in comparison to the concern that like, hey, nobody's going to come to our beaches anymore. Like, in fact, the anecdotal evidence suggests that it actually may lead to a net increase in visitors.
Thank you. And I think one more question for you, Jaime, relates to hurricanes. So we had a couple of people asking about, you know, with the increased occurrence and severity of hurricanes in the area, how is that going to affect both the operational cost of offshore turbines, and like what level of storm severity can they take before they break down, or hopefully don't break down? And then is there a plan to adapt to these extreme frequent storms, infrequent storms?
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe it wasn't too long ago that I looked at this, the design standards for turbines. And I believe at the moment, turbines are required to withstand category 4 wind speeds, which I don't remember what that is off the top of my head. But I believe that's for sustained 30 minutes. Don't quote me on that exactly, but it's close. It's close to that. You know, when we get into category 5 hurricanes, it's tough for any infrastructure, right, to be able to withstand consecutive wind speeds of that degree. Not to say that the industry isn't researching and working towards a clear answer there. So, you know, a couple of things on that front. There's a National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium. A pillar of their research, they're really funding a lot of it's partial private industry, partial federal funding, and they're really leading the way in offshore wind research. And one of the pillars of their research is infrastructure, you know, and turbine designs related to withstanding hurricane force winds. So that will certainly be prioritized in industry research in the near term. And then something else that comes to mind as well, I don't know that I have a picture of Block Island offhand, but you might notice that there's a different foundation for the Block Island wind farm. Instead of being a monopile, so just like an extension of the tower, it's more of a fan. They call it a jacket. It's more of like a fan structure. And those were actually built, those foundations were built in designed and built in Louisiana. And they're very similar to offshore oil and gas platforms. And it's a design that was configured because of the hurricane prone waters of the Gulf of Mexico. So it's innovations like that, as well as continued research from private industry and the research and development consortium that I think we're likely to see to help mitigate some of those concerns.
Thank you for answering all those questions. And Greg, we have a few for you too. So Joy Gunther says, birds are smarter than we give them credit for. How do you see their behavior modifying for turbines?
Yeah, I think it's really going to be dependent on the species. So one of the things we know about birds is that, some birds are really good at adjusting to changes in their environment. So a good analogy is like the reason our state bird is the cardinal is because cardinals love being around, humans and our suburban like environments that we've created. And they're really an adaptable bird. Other birds are the opposite, right? Like any type of disturbance or change, they're going to flee from. And so it really will be species dependent. And part of the unique thing about, off of the Atlantic coast is just because we haven't had any real wind development up to this point, we just don't know enough about what some of those effects will be yet. And so it really impresses upon all of us to make sure that like we have the very best data and that we're tracking it before, during, and after the project so that we can make adjustments as needed. And every single project that we do, we're going to learn a little bit more that we can hopefully use to make the next project better. Part of that also will be understanding how different species relate to these projects that will then inform the next project.
Thank you. And then another viewer or attendee asks, what is the impact on the bird populations of the alternatives to wind? So comparing wind to like offshore drilling and fracking industries.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish I had some of the numbers at hand, but currently, because we have so little offshore wind development, the oil and gas infrastructure in our country has a far more significant impact on birds. Other threats like birds flying into buildings at night when lights are left on is a very significant cause of songbird mortality. I don't want to get into a controversy around cats, but feral cats, eat a lot of birds every year. So there are indeed a number of threats that we believe, have bigger impact than offshore wind development. But I don't want to minimize the potential risk of offshore wind development either, right? If we don't do it right, and that it can have a material impact on certain populations and certain species, depending on where the wind farm is placed, right? And so it is important to kind of keep it in the context of what I believe is the far greater threat from traditional power generation and oil and gas. But we also need to make sure we can do everything we can to mitigate and minimize any potential effects with the new clean energy technology.
Okay, thank you. And I think that pretty much covers, there was another question about Motus towers, but I think your answer to that last question answered about the migrating pattern of birds. So if there are no further questions, I didn't see any more in the chat. I just wanted to ask, is there any take action items us attendees can do? Like, do you want us to contact BOEM or contact our local representatives, our commissioners, our city council members? Is there anything that we can do to help get offshore wind energy sooner rather than later in the Wilmington area?
You want to take that, Jaime?
I'm happy to, and you can fill in the gaps. Certainly a great first step would be to follow along with us with our coalition, Offshore Wind for North Carolina. So that's a really good place to just keep tabs on updates from the state, updates from BOEM, updates from our coalition network and the things that we're working on. You know, an extension of that certainly is the BOEM regulatory process and their public comment periods. It's really meant for this type of engagement to hear how the community is feeling about offshore wind, any specific concerns, and certainly support for moving forward with these lease areas. And then engagement with your local and state lawmakers, should you feel so inclined. You know, if you know, these messages resonated with you, if the need for to reach 100% carbon-free electricity grid, or the economic opportunity is something that you're really excited about and want to see the impacts of in your community, then certainly that's a great way to express those priorities is to your local and state lawmakers.
Yeah, that's right on. I think just, you know, continuing to emphasize support for responsible wind development, and, you know, if local and or state elected officials you know, oppose wind outright, or, you know, with conditions that seem too difficult to meet, you know, really communicating, you know, from your perspective, why you think offshore wind needs to be an important part of our electric mix, and that, you know, we and others believe that it can be done responsibly, would be a great message to continue to get out there.
Could I just ask real quickly, can you all name names about people who are really elected officials that are very interested in seeing this go forward versus some folks who are less inclined to support it, and where that lack of support might be coming from in terms of pressure points on them? I think there was a question in there about who's, you know, why would people be against this on local elected officials, but just, can you give us a sense about names if we're going to try to reach out to our elected officials about this?
Yeah, one thing about Jaime mentioning having people, you know, join our coalition by email is that we'll periodically be sending out things like alerts and requests for assistance in engaging or educating individuals. So right now we're actually, as a coalition, actively doing that type of campaign planning, where we're really trying to make sure we have a good lay of the land of where different levels of support or opposition exist. So we don't have that kind of list that we can share with you today, but if you get involved with a coalition and we have your email, then we can alert the league as opportunities come up where we feel like we really need help, or if there's some individuals that we really need some support with engagement. So that would be very helpful.
And the League of Women Voters, is this something that was on your list of questionnaire, on your questionnaire for the upcoming election cycle?
And we're working on those questions. So we'll have to get back to you on that. And we're not actually the ones that come up with the questions. It comes from the state. So but we can address that later.
And on that too, and is that we have a general question about wind energy, but not specifically offshore league, and we don't know if it's been accepted or not. Thank you.
Yes, and if you, Jaime and Greg, I'm sure are in contact with Beth, and we can always post any take action items on our social media, because I've found that that's the best way to get people to take action is if we post it and there's a link and you can click on it and easily contact your reps. It seems people are more engaged, or it's easier for people to do. Well, I have learned a ton. I will have to watch this recording over because I was, trying to get questions. So I didn't get to actually listen to a ton of it. But you guys are so knowledgeable, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And both of you have shared your emails in the chat. So if people have further questions, is it okay if they just contact you guys directly, Greg and Jaime?
Yep.
Okay. And then the video of this will be posted to our YouTube channel, and we will send out, I'm sure will be on our social media page. All those links have been posted to the chat. So,
and if I could just jump in here.
Let's say a few words.
Just jump in here, Bridget. I just want to, again, thank both of you for the great presentation, and thanks for all the great questions from all the participants. And we will also be sending out the information on the January 28th open house at the Southport Community Center. And so hopefully some of you, especially in Brunswick County, can attend that and learn a little bit more about what Jaime was talking about. So thank you everyone for joining in today. Hope you have a great afternoon. And I hope you've learned a little bit more about offshore wind. Thanks, Jaime and Greg.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, all.
For having us.